The title of this session is The American Spirit, Did It Make a Difference? And in a way, at a much higher level, maybe ethereal in some ways, this session is a continuation of some of what was discussed this morning in the sessions on the Good War. We were supposed to have had Senator George McGovern here on this podium at this time, and Rosie Rosenthal. And as I announced yesterday, to those of you who heard the announcement that Senator McGovern's wife Eleanor is in hospice care just recently, and he could not leave her, and Rosie Rosenthal had health problems of his own. But I'm happy to say that we have a panel of distinguished speakers to address the subject. And I will start off with a few comments, but I want to introduce in the order of their appearance, and they'll each speak 5, 7, 8 minutes on the subject. First is Governor Pete Wilson, is a former U.S. Senator, Governor of California, and presidential candidate, which are all the same qualifications that George McGovern had, so we're happy to have him on the stage. He also, he wasn't governor, that's right, we dropped the governor. We got governor here, and we had, George was a World War II veteran, but they're good friends, and I think they speak from the same position. He is also our chairman of the Board of Trustees, and he's here with his lovely wife, Gail, and maybe you'd stand up and take a bow while you're here. She's been here for the whole conference, and we thank her. Following Governor Wilson will be Hugh Ambrose, former member of the Board of Trustees, Steve Ambrose's son, of course, and historian and author, and currently working with Steven Spielberg on a film with HBO, and a couple of others in the works with CBS, I think, and and another one on Meriwether Lewis, and that's with HBO too. So he's got 3 documentaries in the works right now, and can certainly articulate his father's position on the American spirit, which we're all so familiar with here in this museum. After Hugh, Dr. Alan Millett, been introduced a number of times at this conference. He is the director of the University of New Orleans Eisenhower Center, which was founded by Stephen Ambrose and a big part by Ollie Brown, who's out there somewhere, who was with Freeport-McMoRan at the time, and he was the first chairman of the board of the Eisenhower Center that ultimately led to this museum and had many conferences and programs of its own in the late 80s and early 90s, and is continuing under his active leadership. Alan is one of the great World War II and military historians, with a trilogy on the Korean War coming out. His World War II book, War to be Won, is a classic in the field. Don Miller, professor of history at Lafayette College, distinguished author. His book, Masters of the Air, is, I think, pretty close to the top of the bestseller list, and if you haven't read it, it's a fabulous book, and it's hot and it's fresh, and so I think in addition to that, has written books on the D-Days of the Pacific, and numerous others on World War II. There are too many to mention, and you all have the biographies, and he too has been introduced several times, but he has a special angle of being able to talk about Rosie Rosenthal on this particular subject of the American spirit, since he's interviewed him so many times. That is, didn't leave anybody out. I think that's got everybody here. Now, let me just make a few comments about this subject from the point of view of the American spirit, both during the war and after the war, and there was some indirect discussions about it this morning, and whether or not it did make a difference in World War II. And there are many very difficult issues to deal with on the issue of the American spirit. You can look at the American spirit as it informs and infuses and motivates soldiers on the ground or in the air or on the sea in their actions against the enemy. In terms of their motivation, are you motivated more by when you're inspired by your love of democracy and defense of freedom and defense of country than when you're motivated by fear of reprisals as might be the case with the totalitarian regimes. Those are some of the issues. There are also large-scale national issues of effort and commitment that are important. Do the armies of democracy have an advantage over armies of totalitarian regimes for the reasons of what they are fighting for is part of this discussion. There's a larger scale issue of the national effort, and you'll hear some of that from each of our speakers. But I'd like to read one comment from Max Hastings' book on Armageddon, which says it well to kind of frame this discussion today. He writes, all soldiers are in some measure brutalized by their experience in combat. To an impressive degree, however, the American and British armies preserved in battle the values and decencies, the civilized inhibitions of their societies. It seems appropriate for an historian to offer military judgments upon the failures and shortcomings of the Allies in 1944-45, which were many and various. But there is every reason to cherish and to respect the values that pervaded Eisenhower's armies. And I think that goes to the heart of some of the issues that we will be discussing here. There are other ways in which we can look at the American spirit, both during and after the war, and you will hear discussions on that. One example was given by Professor Weinberg on the post-war treatment of Germany and Japan, which were both transformed into democracies. He also conjectured what the post-war treatment of Europe would have looked like under Nazi rule and a Nazi victory. If you want to compare post-war treatment of East and West Germany is another way to perhaps look at it. What did all of Eastern Europe look like under the Soviet or totalitarian rule compared to what Western Europe looked like under the Allied rule? And then there are the issues of the Marshall Plan, for example, and the Berlin airlift, which Winston Churchill called the most generous act in human history. Is the American spirit part of that, or the Allied Western spirit a part of that? Those are questions for all of us to think about. And then I would just say, perhaps that there's one other incident, since George McGovern is not here, something that Stephen Ambrose mentioned, that immediately after the German surrender in 1945, Lieutenant George McGovern, later U.S. Senator, and his fellow B-24 pilots stationed in southern Italy, who had just finished flying 35 missions from Italy, bombing the enemy, began flying their planes to northern Italy, to Germany, and to Austria, taking food and supplies to their defeated enemies. I think that also speaks to the American spirit, as does another comment from Stephen Ambrose that he was fond of saying. Of course, he said in 1941, after being attacked at Pearl Harbor, that America's counterattacked, which was epic in scale, going from 500,000 man army to almost 16 million under arms in literally 2.5 years. Said we sent the best of our youth halfway around the world in both directions, not to dominate, to build empire, to conquer countries and to bring them under American rule, but to bring democracy and liberation to those countries and to transform them into democracies. That's part of the American spirit. I think that's something that we can all be proud of. Having said those few words, let me turn the podium over to Governor Wilson and to his comments, and I'm going to step down because there are not enough chairs up here, so, and I'll come back if necessary. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I should point out is that there is a classic rule: be careful whom you follow. And this panel has the misfortune to follow the two brilliant panels that we enjoyed so much this morning. But in a very real way, their highly relevant and very incisive analysis assists the topic that has been assigned to us, the American spirit. Was it real? Well, I think it was. I think it is, but it was extraordinary in World War II because never before or unhappily since that great conflict have we seen anything like the focus, the unity that enveloped this nation, not simply our military, but everyone in the country, because something remarkably transformative occurred on December 7th. We were attacked in a highly successful sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. And suddenly, we found that our situation in the world was very different than it had been the day before. On December 8th, there were lines 4 across all the way around the block at recruiting stations all across the land. There were people like Jack Lucas who lied about their age, rather spectacularly. In his case, he was 14, and managed to convince a recruiter that he should be taken into the Marine Corps. His was perhaps an uncommon situation, as he was to prove later. But nonetheless, there were people who were eager to enlist, and this you have to understand from people who had not even considered the thought days before. What happened? Well, obviously Pearl Harbor happened, but I don't think that we can simply ignore the fact that prior to that time, this nation had had in the Congress of the United States and through much of our population a very strongly isolationist sentiment. And I will define that quite specifically. There were people who said, to hell with the war in Europe, that's their problem, not ours. And we should not interrupt our daily lives or expose any Americans to peril in order to participate in it. That was true notwithstanding the fact that we were getting broadcasts from London and from Berlin, from Murrow and Shirer, that were making very clear what was happening in Europe. Less focus was on what was happening in the Far East. When it occurred, the rape of Nanjing was, of course, publicized. It was difficult for Americans to comprehend it. So we were a nation at peace, a naive nation, a nation unprepared for war. It is incredible to think that we put 16 million men under arms in so remarkably short a period of time, because the strength of the United States Marine Corps in 1939 was 17,000 officers and men. Nothing like the force that later was to retake the Pacific, to incredibly assault the island of Iwo Jima. We simply were not in anything remotely like that condition. So what happened? What happened to produce this focus and this unity? Well, as has been earlier observed this morning, no one here liked gas rationing. They didn't like the fact that they had to produce ration stamps from ration books to purchase meat or sugar. Women were not happy that they couldn't have nylons. We engaged in collection efforts that were probably more important symbolically than in terms of the real value, whether it was collecting tinfoil, as small children did, in large balls, or scrap metal or scrap rubber. We couldn't get new tires. We couldn't buy new cars. We were a nation at war in a way that the nation today does not feel that we are at war. Yes, our young men and women have been called to combat. They are valorous. They are professional. And they're professional in the sense that the job that they're doing meets professional standards, even though many of them today, even in an all-volunteer force, are essentially citizen soldiers. But it was not like the situation that obtained in World War II. The slogan that we are all in this together had real meaning. The media treated the war differently than is being accorded to the combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. So yes, there was a uniquely American spirit. We had been attacked, admittedly far from continental United States, but attacked on American soil. In Pearl Harbor and, of course, at Hickam Field in the Philippines. Overnight, any opposition to FDR, if it did not melt, was suppressed in the greater interest of the national good, the clear need to respond as a nation in every way, on the home front as well as in both the Atlantic and in the Pacific. The isolationism that had been so strident disappeared. And suddenly we were a nation united as I think we have not been at any time in our history, before or since. But the lesson that we should have learned is that the man that we were fighting, Hitler, however he may have been seen by those in the House of Commons who were slow to warm to the idea of a second war, having suffered so terribly in the first, it was clear by the time December 7th arrived, the American people, any of whom had been paying any attention, realized that Hitler was a monster, someone who was conducting a genocide that was inexcusably brutal, inexcusably an act against any tenets of humane conduct, and it was also clear that he was bent upon world dominance, along with the Japanese. But it took that blow against us to so mobilize us that we became, as Admiral Yamamoto had warned, the awakened sleeping giant. And we did become the sleeping giant. We did become the arsenal democracy. We supplied all the equipment, if not all, at least a great deal of the equipment that was necessary for the Red Army to function. We were able to bring onto two fronts this massive number of troops and an incredible amount of armament. The air war that Don will speak about again was a truly remarkable industrial mobilization. But fundamental to all of it was what Ken Burns last night referred to as the emotional mobilization of America. Yes, people who do not like to fight, people who do not like rationing, who do not like privation, who wanted to enjoy the fruits and the benefits of peace, emerged from a tough, hard-to-scrabble depression, not to find relief from it, though we finally did receive some economic assistance to lead us out of the depression. But they were mobilized, and they did fight, and they fought well in a way that I hope future generations will learn about and learn to admire. That's why this museum exists. It's why Ken Burns' great movie that we saw excerpted last night will be a triumph of education. It will be more than an entertainment. Those who watch it with any sensibility will understand that freedom isn't free, and that a people who did not want to fight nonetheless fought like hell and won, and made that war not only the most important event of that century, but thank God they did win, because otherwise for the next several centuries we would be in a towering darkness.
Well, Governor Wilson started his speech talking about how tough it is to follow a great speech, and as he spoke, I began to realize that he was right. And I'm very pleased to be here with there's so many friends of the museum and of my family here, and it's great to join you here today for lunch. All of us have been thinking about, since we found out that Senator McGovern could not join us, have been thinking about how we might address this ephemeral yet crucial quality, the American spirit. And when I talk about the American spirit, I just want you to know I think that every country has a great spirit. So we don't mean this in a sense of uniqueness. What we mean is that America's character is different from other countries, and it was a key ingredient that helped us win, and so deservedly has a place when we talk about World War II. And I would take you as well to December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. A large group of Navajo Indians saddled their horses, loaded their rifles, and rode off their reservation to the nearest Army recruiting center. They told the somewhat surprised recruiting officer that they were there and ready, not just to enlist, but to start fighting that very day. Their country had been attacked, and they would go to war. And this inspires me. When I think of the decades that had preceded it, since the end of the Indian Wars, how they had eked out a hardscrabble existence in the desert, where they had been consigned as wards of the United States government. Their government's aim had been to turn their language and their culture and make them white citizens. They had had few educational opportunities, few economic opportunities. Those in the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools were forced to speak and read English only. It is then ironic that the U.S. military enlisted not just the Navajos' courage and manpower, but also their language. The Navajo code talkers became an important part of the military's combat communications system. They could speak over an open radio system, confident that neither the Germans nor the Japanese would ever be able to crack their language. And it's not just the Navajo. There are many tribes, some 15 different tribes, that served in the ETO and in the Pacific. The Code Talker's story deserves to be celebrated and remembered not just because of its success in the war, though, but because it speaks directly again to the American spirit. There were so many others who fought alongside the Navajo who had a somewhat similar story. Young men and women who had joined the military from families, of course, who had endured the Great Depression. They, too, had seen little of the promise of an opportunity that we consider the American dream. Yet they were ready to fight when needed. Among them were African Americans, of course. The Civil War had given them freedom. But throughout the Second World War, or most of it, they remained segregated in the North as well as in the South and segregated in the Army. Their schools were inferior if they existed at all. They were discriminated against in employment, in music, in the movies. Of course, we also have the Japanese American community, soon to be torn from their homes and sent into camps in the desert. Many of them were forced to sell whatever economic assets that their families had been able to develop in the generations since they had moved there. We also, of course, here in this museum celebrate the contribution of the women of America and how they became engaged. The Rosie of the Riveter, of course, that familiar campaign war poster. But of course we have to talk about what happens when the women who begin to work and get engaged and get hired into new jobs and stop being just school teachers and move on to more and different kinds of vocations to help the war effort, and what that means and how that then reverberates through American society ever afterwards and has made us a stronger country because of it, because all Americans, because we're growing towards the meritocracy where you are judged by the quality of your mind and how hard you work. Well, for my father, of course, he always liked to go back to a phrase that he had found in one of Dwight Eisenhower's letters that he wrote to his brother Milton. They were very close when Germany invaded Poland. And he wrote Milton, quote, "Hitler should beware the fury of an aroused democracy." And the young people who stepped forward were determined to demonstrate the truth of that. Later on, Ike would write, as we then began the Cold War that came so soon after World War II, "It would be a grievous error to forget for 1 second the strength and might of this great republic." And so we see our Supreme Commander always, as he quietly reflected to a brother about what would make this work, how we would succeed, getting back to this very simple idea of the American spirit. Because the war, as we look at it today, showed what America could accomplish once the people were unified and fighting as a team. And it began the process of dealing with its sins and shortcomings, of abandoning racism and male chauvinism. It took a long time, and of course, that process is not completed. But racism has given way to openness. Women have opportunities undreamed of by their mothers and grandmothers. Asian Americans, once excluded, became an important part of the country. "We are all in this together," was that common saying. It expressed the essence of the American spirit. Americans believed in democracy so much and had so much faith in their own that in 1944, at the height of the war, they had a national election to pick their leader, something no other nation did. And for me, the magic of World War II is in great part what happened after the war. The governor has touched on this. I can't talk about World War II really without talking about what happened after the war, because I think that's our greatest triumph. Extending our hand to our former enemies. For 12 years, Germany had lived under the totalitarian rule of Hitler and the Nazis, but with American guidance, it became a democracy. And my father loved to tell the story of Eisenhower going to Germany. No, this is Lucius Clay, who went there, general, to oversee the reconstruction of Germany. He called in all of the reporters that had formerly worked for Hitler's regime. And he said, "Now, when I do something wrong, you guys got to criticize me. You got to say, this we don't agree with this. We don't think this is a good plan." And these people were dumbfounded by the idea that they were being given this license, that they were now a free society, and their job as reporters was to evaluate that job being done. Japan as well, a feudal society dominated by its emperor and its military. I mean, during the war, of course, as we know from some of our panels, some of our great veterans who are here to speak to it, the hatred knew no bounds in the Pacific. And for us to be able to overcome that, I think is just a triumph. And it's unparalleled, I believe, in all of the course of human history, and that it is hopefully something that we can never go back from. Hopefully it's something that the world can't go back from. Hopefully, like the Declaration of Independence, in which we declare all people being equal, that it is a bar that has been raised. And now, if there are other great powers that come to the fore in the centuries of human evolution after us, that they will also look back and see that as part of what they must also accomplish. Part of the burden of being a superpower is being bigger than your enemies. And I had written a little bit about George McGovern as well, because I was privileged to work with my father on the Wild Blue, and we love that story of the Americans flying food missions into Austria and Romania and so forth, so soon after they had flown their bombing missions. I was lucky enough to study at the University of Innsbruck actually a couple of summers. The University of New Orleans here has a program. And I met a family, went to dinner one night and had the great joy of listening to the grandmother told me the story of how when she was a little girl in Austria and they heard the planes coming, and that great rumble that was so beautifully told last night in Ken Burns' film, when he talks about that sound of the bombers in Operation Cobra. Well, of course, that sound was heard, that ominous rumbling of those bomber streams coming over to Austria. And she talked about how they'd hear that sound and she'd have to run find her parents. That's what you did. Wherever you were, stopped, you ran, found your parents, and you went into the bomb shelter. And of course, every time you came out of the bomb shelter, then half your village was on fire, and you had to go help put it out, and you had to figure out where you were going to get some food, and you had to understand that part of your city was now broken, or another part of it was broken, and so things were going to get more difficult. And then the one day, she heard the bombers, and she went running for her mom, and her mom said, no, it's fine. And they actually went to the airfield, and there were the planes, there was the food. She thought that was the most amazing thing. Thank you.
I'm sure by now you've determined that the four of us are a pale substitute for Senator McGovern. I was just thinking, you know, if we were in a plane, Pete and I could probably shoot the machine gun since we've both been Marine Corps infantry officers, and Hugh and Don could interview us on the way down as we crashed.
Thanks, Al.
I volunteered to talk about the American spirit and the American economy in the Second World War. I really doubt that an academic historian is the person to have speak about the wisdom of creating wealth, because had that been a consideration, I'd have gone in some other line of work. Happily, my children are both CPAs and money managers, and for those of you who want to read about the rise and fall of Enron, you can read about how one of my sons made himself a millionaire at the expense of the non-company that he helped expose. In any event, economics, however, does run in my family to some degree, because my father, who was a political scientist at Columbia University and ended his career as a university president and running a state system in Ohio, although he had a degree in public administration, he became something of an expert on economic matters. And during the Second World War, in fact, he went from one federal agency and became an instant major in the Army of the United States, principally to help with the problems of economic mobilization. I have, in fact, his copy of a book, which I recommend to all of you, if you can find one, called The United States at War. And this, in fact, is a final report done under the sponsorship of the Bureau of the Budget, and the 8 authors read like the who's who of public administration and finance in the United States of that period. And still, I think, a very useful basic source. Some years ago, Nick called a group of us together and said that we should work on defining the function of one of his projects called the Center for the Study of the American Spirit. Now, we all gathered together assuming that that was something good. I'm sure if we wanted to decide it was something bad, we could have assembled a group that would have easily taken that approach. But I must tell you that it was a little difficult to get 15 intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals or whatever we were to agree exactly upon what the American spirit was. We all had different ideas. I think, however, that one of the things that does make World War II special, and why it does lend itself to some effort to define the American spirit, is simply that Americans do not expect to be poor. They expect to join a society and economy in which they or their children or their grandchildren will eventually better themselves in a material way, and use that material improvement then perhaps to pursue other goals. I can't recall anybody being interviewed at Ellis Island or elsewhere saying, I came to America because I want to continue to be poor. Maybe there are people like that, but I've certainly never read about them. The difficulty then is not just the creation of wealth, but the distribution of wealth and the conditions under which those problems of equity and wealth distribution exist, and how can they be reconciled with a democratic political process. Fortunately, in the Second World War, there was relevant historical experience, which in fact many of the war managers took with them in the government. We sometimes forget that there was World War I, which was a mess from the American standpoint, particularly in terms of economic mobilization and creation of industrial capacity to support a war effort. That experience, however, was saved by many of the people who had participated in that process including Franklin Roosevelt. They then got a chance to revisit some of those problems in dealing with the Great Depression, which my father, in fact, ended up as a surveyor in Indianapolis, Indiana, working for the Works Progress Administration. In fact, he eventually wrote a dissertation about the Works Progress Administration in New York City. And so there was a great deal of relevant experience which had been passed on through two generations of American businessmen, administrators, politicians, and others who then came into government or worked with government during the Second World War to make what Studs Terkel and others, of course, have called the Good War. Now, we all know that war is not equitable at best, but the greatest inequities obviously were in the armed forces, where people were in harm's way and a substantial number were not. On the home front, however, the equity issues cross class lines, regional lines, racial lines, many lines, and in fact it was the political process of finding some kind of social and political equity which may have been the United States' greatest achievement. Because all the material capacity, all of the material support that the United States created to fight the Second World War was not necessarily foreordained. It could have been as big a cock-up as the First World War had been, had not some very wise people taken control of the process. One of the favorite points I try to make in talking to students about the Second World War is the best way to understand it is that of the major belligerents, the United States had the fewest combat casualties, somewhere around 292,000. The United States also spent the most money, somewhere in the excess of $340 billion. And that represented, I think, in our mind, the American way of war. There are some other interesting statistics, which is the American economy actually expanded by about 50% during the war. And in fact, the amount of the economy that went into waging the war was still less than half of the total GNP of that period. We remember rationing and other problems with large durable goods and the rest, but the earning power of the average wage earner during the war increased by about 60%. In fact, much more rapidly than the cost of living did. Why? Because people understood inflation. They understood the debilitating influence of inflation, and in fact took great strides during the war to see to it that that did not demoralize people on the home front. The United States paid for a larger proportion of the war cost of World War II than it had for any war before or after. About 40% of the ongoing costs of the war were actually paid for by the government as the war progressed. Where'd the rest of the money come from? Largely from the American people, of course, through taxation, deferred savings of various kinds, of luxury taxes, and various ways of dealing with the income equity problem, while at the same time allowing people to believe that when the war had ended, this new industrial capacity that was clearly being created was going to then work for the benefit of the American people. The River Rouge might go back to building trucks and cars rather than bombers. I think another aspect that we often overlook is the degree of innovativeness that this system allowed or inspired. In the First World War, there are all kinds of wretched examples of people who knew absolutely nothing about building things being given contracts. My most famous example is the sculptor who did, Mr. Borglund, who did the faces out in South Dakota, was given a contract to build aircraft. Figure that one out. That didn't happen in the Second World War, largely because the War Department from 1930 on had dealt with something called the Industrial Mobilization Plan, which, while it had its political problems, creating a single economic czar was one of them. Nevertheless, at the technical level, done a very good job at identifying just exactly who was going to make what and how long, what the contracting relationships would be, and many of the difficulties of getting American business to cooperate in the war effort were largely solved before Pearl Harbor, simply because there had been this ongoing discussion between industry and the military over what the relations should be, and none of these businesses were really going to do government work and go broke doing it. That certainly would have been un-American. But if you go back and take a look at this experience, you see one, this certainly collective effort across traditional borders which had divided Americans, and the pursuit of victory, but within an economic context, which meant that there would still be an America and a very larger and stronger America in an economic sense when the war was over. And I think that degree of collaboration, which was based on people's understanding of the Depression and World War I and the difficulties that the government had had during those periods, not only a good example of learning from history, which doesn't go on much, to tell you the truth, but by the fact that under extreme measures, all kinds of collaboration, which may on the face of it seem impossible, like coal miners and coal operators actually agreeing on working conditions, all these things become possible within the democratic political process. Thank you very much.
Alan said just pull it up, right? Hi. Can you hear me? Is it on? Okay. Well, I'm here to represent, and a poor representative I am, of Robert Rosie Rosenthal. Now, I had asked Rosie, who is perhaps the most decorated 8th Air Force veteran of World War II, to come and speak to us. He was eager to do that. But he called me a week ago and told me he had incurable cancer, that it had spread, and that he couldn't make it. He waited till the last minute. He had cancer, his cancer had infected his eyelids, and what really made this terrible was he's unable to read, and he's an inveterate reader. He had to put down and failed to complete Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, one of his favorite books. And when I called him last night and told him I'd be speaking about the American spirit and using him as an exemplar of the American spirit, he said, "Don't do that." He said, "I wasn't in this war to save Americans. I was in this war to save humanity. Because a country had made a leap into barbarism and had to be stopped. And I signed up on Pearl Harbor Monday because I had seen the newsreels. I had seen the newsreels of Nuremberg. And it wasn't the strutting Fuhrer that impressed and scared me. It was the adoring looks on the faces of the German men, women, and children as they looked on their Fuhrer. He said a whole country had gone crazy and had to be stopped. Well, Rosie at the time was 26 years old, older than most guys who signed up. And he had been an All-American baseball player and an All-American football player at Brooklyn College. He was a poor kid from Flatbush, grew up adoring the Dodgers, jazz music, normal New York childhood. But a month before Pearl Harbor, he got the job of his dreams in a prestigious Manhattan law firm. And then Pearl Harbor came along, and he dropped that and joined the Army Air Corps. He joined a unit called the Bloody 100th. They would get that name because of the casualties they took in the air war over England. The unit that he joined arrived in England in the spring of '43, and by September, they were down 84%. On his third mission, he flew to a place called Munster, a German railroad center. Only one plane from his bomb group returned from Munster, his plane. When he landed, he said to his commander, "Are they all this tough?" Well, a lot of them were. Rosie finished his 25, his allocated number of missions, and he signed up again. They told him, "Go home, Rosie, you did enough. There's ice cream and women, and America's prosperous. There's another world back there." He said, "I'm going to fly," and he wasn't big into histrionics, But he told a friend quietly, I'm going to fly until I'm dead or Hitler's gone. That's why I got in this thing. And I've seen the suffering the English people have undergone. London had a powerful, powerful, visceral impression on him. And Rosie flew 52 missions in the war. He was shot down 3 times. The last time he was shot down, it was on a gigantic American raid, a terror raid actually, on Berlin on February 3rd, 1945. And he was leading the 8th Air Force. His plane was hit by flak and almost torn in half just before they began the bombing run. His co-pilot looked over to him, smoke filled the cockpit, and Rosie just gave the head for the target. They hit the target, the center of the Nazi nerve center and Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. They banked, and Rosie hit the bailout button as soon as he went behind Russian lines, where he knew his men had a chance. He stayed in the plane. Everybody bailed out. When these big forts went down, they didn't usually go down vertically. They went into things that the men called death spins, round and round and round, sometimes spinning so much and so fast that the plane literally crumbled to pieces before it reached the ground. In this death spin, the centrifugal force is immense, and Rosie was trapped in the pilot seat. He pulled his safety belt off, but he was pinned. And he said, trying to get to that escape hatch in the plexiglass nose of the plane was like pushing yourself through quicksand. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He got to there somehow. He doesn't quite know how. He wasn't a praying man, he said, but he got there. And bailed out at 3,000 feet. You can imagine what a body-crushing drop that was. He lands behind Russian lines, right in the middle of a firefight between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, which, thank God, the Red Army won. Rosie's in a foxhole. He had a revolver, but he said, I didn't dare use it. Useless. He peeked up. His arm was broken. His leg was broken. He peeked up and saw this bear of a Russian soldier rushing at him, big hammer and sickle, with his rifle pointed at him. He said, I didn't know what to do. He jumped out of the foxhole, spread his arms in the air, and started screaming, Roosevelt, Stalin, Lucky Strike, Coca-Cola. So they wouldn't identify him as a German. He was taken behind Russian lines. He had, 2 days later, he was feted by Averell Harriman. He met Joseph Stalin. And they called back to his base and said, to the 100th base in Thorpe Abbotts, England, and they said, Rosie, your war is over, and we're transferring you back there, and you're going back to the States. He said, oh, my war's not over. He made a second call and said, this thing isn't over. And then when it was over, in May of 1945, he signed up for duty in the Pacific, and he was in Florida in training on B-29s when VJ Day came. But so he went back to New York, went back to his Manhattan law firm, and he was sitting there one day shuffling papers and thinking to himself, how stupidly insignificant this work seems compared to all I've been through in this war. This was the dream job of my life, and it seems irrelevant. And he'd been reading the papers about the Nuremberg trials. So he went down to Washington. He said, look, I'm a lawyer. Give me a posting at Nuremberg. They made him a prosecuting attorney at Nuremberg. Put him on a ship. On the ship, he met a young Navy prosecutor. Her name was Phyllis Hiller. Beautiful young woman. They hit it off instantly. Rosie wanted to marry her. He said, I didn't know whether I was seasick or in love, but I gave her the benefit of the doubt. So, she says to him, well, you know, I'll marry you as soon as we get to Nuremberg, but I got to ask for my father's permission first because I'm an old-fashioned girl from a Jewish family. And he said, fine, I'll write the letter. He wrote the letter home to her father. A telegram came back and said, stop. You're both too young. Permission not granted. Rosie turned to her and said, well, that's it. She said, no, it's not it. She said, "You have to remember, I asked you to write the letter because I needed to ask his permission, not get his permission." And as he said, I knew I was in trouble then. I'd married a lawyer. Well, Rosie went to Nuremberg. They were married there in a city that the Americans said was declared 99% dead. They saw the obliteration of, what was once a great medieval city. He said he knew things had gotten bad, but because Phyllis smoked, and they were out for a walk, and she threw a cigarette on the ground, and this very respectable-looking German had been trailing them, probably because she was smoking, and he raced up with a toothpick and picked it up and put it in his mouth for the last two. See, that's what the German people were reduced to. But Nuremberg was central. And Phyllis got for her, enviable position of bringing to trial I.G. Farben, the gigantic petrochemical firm that was Nazified in the 1930s, stripped of its Jewish board of directors, and turned into one of the most malicious industrial fortress operations in world history. They ran Buna. They ran the labor camp with SS guards at Auschwitz. Well, she went after these people, and it was a great satisfaction for her to do it. Rosie went after the German civilians and Luftwaffe police who had tortured and killed, and the numbers are very great, contrary to public opinion, contrary to most historical opinion. They are very great. The numbers of Allied airmen who were tortured and killed by Germans during the war. But in the process of doing that, he had a chance to interview and interrogate Goering, Goering, Keitel, and Jodl. Keitel and Jodl, of course, two of Hitler's military advisors who Albert Speer called the nodding donkeys because they agree with everything Hitler said. And Rosie said to me, in conclusion here, he said, seeing them in their cells, sentenced, seeing them in their cells, these jackbooting, Jew-killing Nazis, helpless and waiting for the hangman, was the closure I needed. My war was over. 1 month later, he left Nuremberg. Phyllis was pregnant, and they began a new life. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a wonderful panel discussion, and I think at the end of it all, I think the question, if it's not answered now, the American spirit, did it make a difference? I think we all can feel that it did. The American spirit, however difficult it is to define, it's one of those things that you know it when you see it. And I think everyone here gave examples of that. I would just end on a personal anecdote, because I first saw that American spirit. My own father, who was a German-American born in 1902 and immigrated to this country in 1923. He'd seen his uncle go off to America and when he was 10 years old in 1912 before World War I. And his father, my father's father, was one of those Germans, immigrants from all over the world, especially Europe in the 19th century and the 20th century, who knew the American spirit. And that's one reason they came to this country by the millions. It was something that it was recognized. If it can't be defined, it was recognized and understood. And to show the motivation of that, my father was crazy to come to America like his uncle. He arrived in Ellis Island in 1923, left in the midst of the Great Depression in Germany. Arrived, went through Ellis Island, caught the train to go visit his uncle, to stay with his uncle in Milwaukee. Arrived there in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning in a snowstorm. They woke his uncle up. They talked all night. At 8 o'clock in the morning, my father, now out of money, walked 5 miles through the snow to downtown Milwaukee to the Immigration and Naturalization Office, and was standing there right before 9 o'clock when the door opened. And they said, well, when did you get to this country? Because he said he wanted to immigrate and to be naturalized as an American citizen. They said, when did you get to this country? He said, yesterday. I came through Ellis Island. They said, yesterday? You're here already? And he said, well, I know I have to wait 5 years and I want to get started right away. So he was the first one there. I think that's the American spirit you can't define, but is out there, and I think it did make a difference. Thank you all so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of the program this afternoon. And join me in thanking the panel.